Well, hello, friends. Glad you could join me for another broadcast of Wallace on Mission. I was uh, I was young once, a long time ago, about when I was 19. Actually, I was not bad looking, if I do say so. I had just come off, 4 years of high school football, and so my body was like hard, and I had the six pack abs and all that. And I gotten hired that year to be a lifeguard. And so um, I was tan that year. My hair was curly and bleached blonde by the sun. And so what I needed, I thought at that time, was I needed a girlfriend to sort of match this image of myself. And I found her. She was athletic also. She had also sun bleached blonde hair, and she was tanned. And so that summer, later in the summer, when we would walk into a restaurant, man, we turned some heads. And well, she did. I think they looked at her first, and then they looked at me like, "What are you doing with that guy?" But be that as it may, that was my relationship when I was young with this particular lady. Now, was I in love with her? In hindsight, I would have to say probably not. But I was in love with the idea of her, and there is a difference. I just didn't know at the time that there was a difference. My love for her would be probably what you would call transactional, and so was her love for me, as opposed to relational. We used each other in reality to elevate ourselves, but we did not love each other. And so when the summer ended and our tans faded, our transactional love also faded. So she broke up with me, I think mid September, and I was actually okay with that. So, what in the world does this have to do with my teaching out of the Bible? Good question. Let me begin with a question. If you are a follower of Jesus, well, actually, for anybody out there, let's say you're not a follower or you are a follower, there are three options, three answers to this question, or three. Well, let me just ask: do you love King Jesus, or do you hate King Jesus? Or, and some of you might not be aware, there's a third option, and that option is: do you just love the idea of King Jesus? There's a difference. So we're all going to end up before this life is over, kind of in one of those three camps, if you will. In reality, there's only two camps. If you love the idea of King Jesus, you don't really love him. That's an empty way of life, um, and you're going to end up with nothing. Kind of like me and the girl I was dating. And when it comes down to just loving the idea of Jesus, is effectively hating Jesus. So, which camp are you in? In our biblical story today, by the way, we've been looking at different chapters in the Old Testament, and I've been going chronologically. I started in Genesis, went to Exodus, and then Leviticus. We finished Leviticus last week, if you're just visiting this channel for the first time. And I was going to start Numbers today, and I did glean some things out of Numbers that were really cool, but it wasn't enough for me to make a video. So I kind of set that aside, and I thought, I really want to talk about this other chapter in the Old Testament where we can find King Jesus represented there. Okay. So I'm going to talk out of 1 Samuel today, chapter 18. And if you know the story of Samuel, some of the best stories in the Bible are in Samuel. They ought to make more movies out of those. They're just incredible stories. One of them you probably are familiar with, and that's David, when David slew Goliath. That's in chapter 17, which I'm going to skip over because it's preached on, taught on a lot. And I really like the themes I found in chapter 18, and they really relate well to what we're talking about today. This idea of relational love, or this idea of transactional love, or this idea of hate. They're all represented there. Okay? So when you look at 17, though, you see where all the Israelites are fleeing from the battle lines. They're running away as fast as they can, trying to get away from the Philistines. And David is marching resolutely toward the battle lines because he feels like, man, this battle is the Lord's. I know Goliath is over there. I know that giant standing there, but God's going to take him down, right? And so David basically goes and takes out the giant. And by doing that, he delivers the Israelites from slavery and death. And I wonder if you follow Jesus, if that sounds familiar to you, because it really ought to. So, oh man, sorry. Cool. I'm looking outside. I'm seeing a bunch of hummingbirds out there. Beautiful. Anyway, if you If you follow Jesus, you should recognize the story, because in the same way, Jesus fought a giant, only he was a giant dragon. He was the giant, that is Satan, and Jesus defeated him by triumphing over him at the cross. And because of the extraordinary act of faith and courage on Jesus' behalf, he ended up humbling himself, Jesus did, to death on the cross. And because of that, the scripture says that God exalted him to the highest place where every knee would bow and every tongue would confess that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus is King. And so David foreshadows Jesus. David is what's called a type of Jesus. What David did in the natural, Jesus did in the supernatural. And since David became king of Israel, because after all, he had a heart after God, God said, I have found a man after my own heart, speaking of David. Because David had courage and love for God, right? Faith and love for God. And because of that, David got this physical kingship. And Jesus, the Son of God, who also had an amazing heart for his Father and had amazing courage and faith, and because he took out the giant, the spiritual giant, God raises him up to be king of everything. So David's king in the natural, Jesus is king in the supernatural, over all that is seen and unseen. In David's case, his act of courage and faith displayed in the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel, it invokes reactions from different people in chapter 18. And the reactions fall pretty much like the options that I mentioned earlier when I gave you those questions. And here are the reactions you see in chapter 18. You see love for King David. You see hatred for King David. And then you see, interestingly enough, love with the idea of King David, but not true love. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Look at, if you have a Bible or phone, look at 1 Samuel 18. Let's start at verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and would not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself, says it again. Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing, he gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. And so what I want to point out to you in this broadcast is, number one, true love is selfless. I mean, there's lots of evidence here that Jonathan has true love and selfless love for David, because you see that he becomes one in spirit with David. You see him loving David as himself. It says that twice. You see Jonathan making a covenant with David. Then you see Jonathan taking off his royal garments and giving them to David, even his weapons of war. Now, this last gift was probably the most impressive, because when you look at what happened during that time in Israel's history, nobody in Israel had swords, with the exception of King Saul and his son Jonathan. Those are the only guys in all of Israel with swords. The Philistines wouldn't let them have them. They kept the instruments of warfare out of the Israelites' hands so that they could dominate them. So if you were an Israelite and you wanted to go to battle against the Philistines, basically had to grab your farm implements or clubs or sticks or rocks. That's all you had to choose from. That's what David uses when he takes down Goliath, by the way, as a rock. So this was a really significant gift by Jonathan to David. It's showing selflessness. It's showing true love. Okay, so that's the picture. But here's the deal. True love is only proven when it's what? When it's tested, correct? And so Jonathan's love for David becomes tested, because Jonathan has realized eventually in the story that he himself will not be king of Israel. Even though he's the son of King Saul and it rightfully should go to him, Jonathan realizes that God has chosen David to become king. So what does Jonathan do? Does he fight that? Does he fight David? Does Jonathan have a change of heart for David? Or does he respond differently, the way that true love would respond? Well, later in the stories, David is being pursued by Saul, and Saul is trying to catch David to destroy him, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. But the point at this point is that if Saul catches David and he kills him, David is dead, and Jonathan then will receive the kingship. So at one point, Saul is chasing David around one side of the mountain, and David's on the other side, and they're kind of going round and around this mountain. And David is exhausted. And you would think Jonathan would support his dad to take David out so that Jonathan could become king. But he doesn't do that. And by the standards of this world, Jonathan should have done that, but he doesn't. Jonathan has true love for David. When you check it out in a little further in the book, I'm going to come back to 18, but I want to just point this out to you. In chapter 23, verse 15, it says, when David was at Horish in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life, and Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horish and helped him find strength in God. Don't be afraid, he said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horish. Now, by the way, there's a website out there, you guys. It's called I Am Second, and it's a YouTube channel too. I highly recommend it. There are countless stories on there, videos of people telling their story where they've come into relationship with Jesus and they've made him first and themselves second. And the website is called I Am Second. That's what the whole point of it is. And it comes from this particular story where Jonathan says, I could be first if I force my way, but I'm not. I'm going to choose to be second and make my friend David first. This is the type of heart that God's looking for in his people with Jesus. Because transactional love says, I'm first and I will love you as long as you give me what I need to stay first. But true love says, you, Jesus, are first and I will be second to you. Do you have true love for Jesus? Or do you have more of a transactional love for Jesus if you're a follower of him? It's a fair question. In the Gospel of John, we discover something very similar there, because there's a very close relationship between Jesus and one of his disciples, kind of like David and Jonathan. Now, John himself doesn't name that disciple. He just simply calls him 4 times in that gospel. He says, the disciple whom Jesus loves. Well, do you know which disciple it is? It's actually John, because towards the end of John's gospel, the very last chapter, John identifies the disciple whom Jesus loves as the same disciple who's writing down the story. And scholars have identified that disciple as John. So John's talking about himself, but he's so humble. He says, well, I'm not going to mention myself, but you know, the one that Jesus loved, the close relationship there. And so what a coincidence that David, who foreshadows Jesus, has a best friend named Jonathan. And Jesus, who fulfills the prophecies of David, also has a best friend named John. Now, is it a coincidence? I think not. There's a reason both Jesus and David have a best friend with the same name, John. God is trying to get our attention because we all have the opportunity to be the best friend of Jesus. That's the point. It's not just one. When we get to heaven, space and time have no meaning. And so everyone can get close to Jesus, and everyone has all the time in the world to be his best friend. And when Jesus was on earth, he was reclining. I hope you can still hear me. I'm going to lean back there as a demonstration. Jesus is reclining at the table, the Last Supper. They're eating, and John leans back against him, against his chest. And it's a beautiful picture of friendship. Now, in our culture, it looks weird. People go, homosexual? No, that's not what was going on. Definitely they were heterosexual. But the point is, they had a tight relationship. And we'll see that displayed here in a bit. So John loves Jesus the way Jonathan loved David. The evidence is really strong. In John chapter 1, for example, John the Baptist, he sees Jesus coming, and John the Baptist has 2 disciples. I know it's a little confusing, a lot of Johns. By the way, there's a lot of Marys too. So there's 2 Johns. John the Baptist has a disciple named John with his friend Andrew. And John the Baptist sees Jesus coming, and he points him out to these guys. He says, look, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. The next day he sees him again. He says, behold, the Lamb of God. And so then the 2 disciples, that's John and Andrew, they leave John the Baptist and they go follow Jesus, which is, by the way, the point of John's ministry, to point people to Jesus. And so John and Andrew are following Jesus, and Jesus looks behind him and he says to them, what do you guys want? Which is a fair question, right? And I think it's a question Jesus wants us all to answer when we try to follow him. What do you want? What are you looking for? See, the answer to that question reveals the kind of love we have for Jesus. Is it relational, like true love, or is it more of a transactional love? I mean, why are you following Jesus? Is it to get something from him? Or is it out of love for him? Is it to make him first in your life and to make yourself second? You see, that's heart. That's John's heart towards Jesus, because John responds to Jesus, his rabbi. When Jesus asks a question, what do you want? He says, Rabbi, where are you staying? He answers a question with a question. You see, and so Jesus says, well, come and see you guys, right? See, John doesn't say, hey, we want to be blessed by you. We want to be known as followers of you, the most important rabbi. We want to see a miracle. We want to see you walk on water. We want healings. We want to see you raise the dead. We want. No. John says simply, Rabbi, can I be with you? Because that was sort of a euphemism in those days. If you were going to, hey, can I stay with you? Where are you staying? It's kind of one and the same. Would you host me? Would you take me in, basically? You see the heart of John. John doesn't want stuff from Jesus. John wants Jesus. John is after the very heart of God, not the hand of God. So listen, when we go to Jesus and we ask him to bless our lives, Lord, I'm going to go do this. I got this to do today, this to do today, this to do today. I need your blessing. We are essentially saying, Jesus, follow me. Really? That's what we're saying. Instead of following Jesus. You see the difference? Jesus says, come follow me. And we go, no, I got to go do this, but would you bless me? See, the second form of that is transactional. The first form, when we just follow him, is relational. And that's what John does. And that's the picture. That's how we see that John has the same kind of love for Jesus as does Jonathan for David. Back in our story, there was another group who, like Jonathan, loved David. And that was the crowds, particularly the crowds of women, because crowds of women would sing to David. How do you know you're popular? When the women start singing to you, right? They would sing to David when he came into the city. Check out this part of the story. It's found in 1 Samuel 18. I'm going to read verse 6 and 7. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, with tambourines and lutes. And as they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands. Well, Pastor, I thought you were talking about them singing to David. Well, listen to what they sing about David. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. David is an instant celebrity. All the women love him. And in their song, they demote King Saul and they promote soon-to-be King David. This is going to be a problem. You know, when I was a young man in church, I used to sing solos a lot. I was a tenor, and so they would give me all the high parts that they needed a solo for. I was kind of the go-to dude for that. But as the church grew, so did the number of people who could sing. And pretty soon there was this other dude that could sing higher than me and better than me. And he started getting the solos. And so I had to take that one to Jesus. And I'm like complaining, and Jesus like, well, who are you singing for? You or me? Ow. You see, Jesus done took me to the woodship, and I got myself a whooping, right? Fortunately, and by the grace of God, I learned my lesson. I said, okay, you're first, I'll be second, right? But this was going to be a problem for Saul. It was going to take him out. Chapter 18 now, verse 8 to 11, Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me only with thousands. Talk about transactional, right? He's doing the transaction. What more can David get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The next day, this is the progression. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. And Saul was prophesying in his house when David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it at David, saying, I'm going to pin that man to the wall. And David eluded him not once, but twice. So my second point in this talk here is that jealousy and envy, which is the second option of how to approach Jesus, lead to darkness and eventually murder. That's where the hatred comes in. See, King Saul would spend the rest of his life, the rest of his kingship, all his resources, trying to chase David down and kill him. Meanwhile, David ran from Saul and hid until God removed Saul from the kingship and put David in his place. Okay? It's the same in the days of Jesus. The religious leaders wanted the power. They're like Saul. They wanted the notoriety. They wanted the money that came from being priests and being in charge. So they became jealous of the crowds that followed Jesus, and their jealousy um, of those crowds caused them to go after Jesus. Just like all the women were singing to David, the crowds were basically worshiping Jesus. This caused them to envy Jesus and eventually kill him because, envy is no bueno. Just telling you. Even Pontius Pilate recognized this as their motivation when he condemned Jesus to death. Pilate, in Mark 15, Pilate says to the leaders, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" As Pilate in verse 10 says, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. It's like, here's your king. You want him? He's knowing that they don't. He's knowing it's envy, and he's knowing they want to kill him, which is what happens when you envy and when you hate someone. You want to kill him. That's why Jesus said in the Beatitudes, he said, do not even hate your brother. The person who hates his brother is in danger of the fires of hell. And he compared that to murder. He said, you've heard that it said, do not murder, but I tell you, don't even hate your brother. And these Pharisees hated Jesus, and they murdered him. That's where it goes. This is where jealousy and envy lead. Listen, all who reject Christ do so because they do not want to give up the throne of their lives to somebody else. They want to be king. It's not just a lack of faith, rather it's a lack of love for Jesus. They would rather love themselves and be in charge than love Jesus and be second. Does that describe you? Listen, he does love you, and make no mistake, he will love you forever, but he will let you have your way. He will. If you do not want him, you don't have to have him. But the absence of Jesus in your life brings on the presence of evil in your life. Look what happened to Saul. Look what happened to these Pharisees. Jesus is called the light of the world. And if you turn the light off, what are you left with? Darkness. Should be obvious. Saul envied and hated David, and eventually Saul went mad. Ultimately, rejecting Jesus out of hatred results in hell. And hell is madness because you don't have to go there. All you have to do is place your trust in Jesus and give him your heart. That's all you have to do, is surrender your heart to him. But listen, you want to make sure that when you do that, that your love for him is true love. It's relational love. And it's not transactional. Because, you guys, that's the third response we see in our David story today. It's the third option that so many so-called Christians have towards Jesus, and they may not even know it. Take a look at the next part of our story. This is, again, 1 Samuel 18. I'm going to read 20 and 21 after I drink my tea. I love having tea with you guys. It's fun. Now, Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David. What's not to love, right? And when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. See, Saul, you guys, was still hating on David, and he devised this wicked plan. Saul thought to himself, I'll make the bridal price for my daughter 100 Philistine lives. If David takes out 100, he can have my daughter. And what Saul was thinking was, maybe the Philistines will do the work for me. That's what he was thinking. So what's David going to do? Well, David's a little bit of an overachiever. We've seen that already. Verse 27 of chapter 18, David and his men went out and they killed 200 Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and presented the full number of foreskins to the king so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter, Michal, in marriage. Can you imagine being an accountant for Saul? Call for the accountants. We need someone to count the foreskins. Somebody had to, because they knew there were 200 of them, right? Now, I admit it's a weird culture. I've heard of cultures where the bridal price was like a cow, right? You want to marry my daughter? You got to bring me a cow. Or if she was exceptionally beautiful, you got to bring me 2 cows. Imagine, though, if you were the daughter and a guy brings 5 cows for you. You're a 5-cow woman. Those are some serious bragging rights of being a 5-cow wife, right? And that's what the deal was with Michal, the daughter of Saul. She can now tell her friends, I'm a 200 foreskin woman. Supposed to only be a 100 foreskin woman, but now I'm a 200 foreskin woman. I know it's weird, you guys, but it is funny, you have to admit. But the reality with Michal is that is exactly the type of love that she had for King David. She was looking for bragging rights. She, like Jonathan and all the other women, they were impressed. She was impressed with David's superstar quality. I mean, killing giants, killing thousands of Philistines. He had courage. He had faithfulness. He was also, the Bible describes him as ruddy, meaning his face was bright. He was good looking. And he was a musician. David was a freaking rock star, okay, in her mind. And by being his first wife, remember they married multiple wives in that culture, that would have put her in charge of the whole household. That would put Michal in a very powerful position in the family and in the fame train of David. So yeah, she was in love with him. Or maybe she was just in love with the idea of David. See, the problem with just being in love with the idea of someone or something is that your love is just transactional at that point, which is not love at all. And ultimately, it will lead you to emptiness. That's what we discover in this story. The third point I want to say, the third option for approaching Christ, is that transactional love leaves you empty. See, this is what happened to Michal. Because later, when her father Saul and her brother Jonathan had died in battle, both on the same day, by the way, David is then elevated to the kingship. And she, as the first wife, would become queen. Her fame has just now skyrocketed, okay? She is now number one. Well, David is number one, but in her mind, she is. Now, how do we know this? Is her attitude. Well, at one point, David wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. To do it correctly, he makes sure that the Levites are carrying it in the prescribed manner, okay? And he makes sure that there's sacrifices happening ahead of it, and then he himself is worshiping and dancing before the Lord with all his might. And while he's doing this, he's wearing nothing but a white linen ephod, like a priest would. And Michal wants nothing to do with this procession. She stays home. For her, David's relationship with God is an unwanted distraction. It takes the attention off herself and the people's attention off her. So when she's looking out her window and the procession's finally coming back to Jerusalem and she sees it coming, well, let me just read what happens. This is found in 2 Samuel 6. It says, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Now, wait a minute. I thought we just read in the scriptures where it said she loved David. How could she love him then and despise him now? Why is she scorning him? What happened? Well, she was never in love with King David. If she was, she would love his relationship with God. She would love the fact that he worshiped God openly like this. She wasn't in love with David. She was in love with the idea of King David, who acted kingly, who would match her perception of herself. You know, a king that would bless her in front of all the people. Again, how do you get there, Pastor? Well, when you look in that same chapter, 2 chapter 6 and now verse 20, it says, when David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would. 3 times in Hebrew, in that text, when you look at that in Hebrew, 3 times Michal uses this word nude. You have been naked, naked, naked. And then in the Hebrew, she calls him worthless. So the first thing he sees or hears when he sees his wife is naked, 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 worthless. Wow. Her contempt is powerful. And notice what her main concern here is that David did this in front of the slave girls of David's servants, the lowest of the low. See, she wants bragging rights among the powerful women in the community, but instead she's shamed before the lowest of the low women in the community. You see that? Now, what I don't want you to miss is that Michal had to pay a serious price for this transactional love for David. And by the way, it's the same price people pay when they love Jesus transactionally. I'll get to that in a second. But verse 21 of the same chapter, David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from your house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord, and I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in high honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Do you see where transactional love led to her emptiness? You see that? No children was a shameful life in that culture and time. Why? Well, every Jewish woman wanted to provide children for her husband so he could be proud of her. Every Jewish woman also wanted to give birth to the Messiah. That was like the most honorable thing you could do as a woman. Or at least somewhere in your family line the Messiah would come and flow through you, right? That's what they wanted. Michal had no children. She had no prospect for that. She ended up missing out on the Messiah completely. And so that's the picture, because she was ashamed of David's love for God. So the line, instead of Messiah, instead of going through Michal, it went through like David's fifth or sixth or seventh wife. I don't even know. But it was the wife Bathsheba and her son Solomon. That's the lineage through who Jesus came. Very interesting. So her transactional love for David caused her to come up empty. In the same way, Jesus warns us, you guys, about being ashamed of him and of the gospel. And he warns us in the gospels. He tells us that if we are ashamed of him and his words, he will be ashamed of us before our Father in heaven. So we have a choice. We can, like David, humiliate ourselves before God. Or we can be ashamed and go, I'm not going to say anything about Jesus, right? It's one or the other. Friends, don't be ashamed of Jesus. Love him on Sunday when you go to church, but testify about him on Monday when you go to work. Okay? So Jesus had John, his John, like Jonathan. David had Jonathan. But Jesus also had a Michal. I don't mean a wife. He didn't have a wife. Those claims about Jesus are blatantly false. Jesus, his Michal was actually Judas. And what I mean by that is that Judas loved the idea of King Jesus, but only as it benefited himself. Judas' love for Jesus was transactional. And the moment that Judas realized that Jesus was not going to benefit him in the way that Judas wanted to be benefited, Judas then, in true transactional form, sold Jesus for silver. Talk about transactional love. Oh, you're not going to be like I want you to be to help me be king on my life? I'm going to sell you. I'm going to trade you, transaction you for silver. It's exactly what Judas did. He sold him for silver. But the silver did not satisfy Judas. Listen, it didn't satisfy him. And he ends up throwing it back at the Pharisees in the temple, and he hangs himself. What happened? Judas' transactional love for Jesus caused Judas to be empty. Don't be a Judas, you guys. Be a John. Be a Jonathan. When David had heard that Jonathan had been killed, he wrote a song and he lamented the loss of his friend. And in that song, one of the lyrics is really interesting. He says, Jonathan, your love was better than that of a woman. And I think what David had in mind there was his wife, Michal. It's like, Jonathan, you are my brother-in-law, but your love for me was better than that of my wife. Church, don't be a Michal. Don't have transactional love for the king. And don't be a Saul and hate on King Jesus. Be a Jonathan and love Jesus deeply and relationally. I don't know if you remember this, but Jesus rebuked the church in the book of Revelation. By the way, John wrote the book of Revelation. And in that book, chapters 2 and 3, there are 7 rebukes for 7 churches in Asia Minor. One of those churches, the first church, is the church of Ephesus. And Jesus rebukes the church of Ephesus. First, he commends them. He goes, you guys are doing great. You're working hard. You're evaluating false teachers and you're booting them out. You're trying to live holy lives. And yet Jesus rebuked them. Why? Because they had left behind Jesus. They were doing all this great stuff, but they forgot why. Friends, don't get caught up on stuff doing for God's blessing and miss the most important part of the story, which is Jesus. Let's not sell everything we have to buy the field, but then ignore the treasure. Jesus is the treasure in the field. I'm referring to that parable he told about the kingdom of God. He said the kingdom of God is like a man who's walking through a field. He stumbled on a treasure. He found the treasure and he sold everything he had and he bought the field so that he could get the treasure. He didn't buy the field so he could have the field. He didn't care about the field. He wanted the treasure. That's why he bought it. I have a friend I've been discipling. and in Jesus, and Jesus has delivered him from a heroin addiction, really bad addiction for years. He's been clean now for 18 months. He's working, he's thinking straight, he's doing well, got a car, all that. But his attitude is like, well, I'm grateful for what God has done, but I think I got it from here. He even said to me, yeah, you know that song, This is the Air I Breathe. He goes, I don't see Jesus as the air I breathe. And my heart breaks for my friend because he's missed the heart of God. He's gotten the field, but he's missed the treasure of Jesus. Let's not sell everything we have and buy the field and miss Jesus. Let's not look to get to heaven someday so we can have all our rewards and blessings, our mansion and all the stuff he has for us, and forget that heaven means nothing without Jesus. This is all for King Jesus. It's all about him. It's all for him because he is that beautiful. He is that holy. He is that righteous. He is that lovely. He is filled with that much love for us. Let's focus our lives on him, my friends. He's the reason for everything. He's the focal point of the universe. If you don't follow Jesus and you want your own, he's going to give that to you. But I implore you, don't hate him. Turn your heart over to him. Love him because he's worthy and he's worth it. He has all the stuff for you. Transactions are all there. But pursue his heart. Pursue him. Pursue him like Jonathan did David. Don't be a Michael. Don't be a Judas. Be a Jonathan. Be a John. And love him with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength. I hope that you'll do that today. Thanks for listening. If you made it this far, you're a rock star. God bless you, and we'll see you next week if the Lord doesn't return. In the meantime, bye for now.